March 1962, Palm Springs, California. Frank Sinatra stood in the courtyard of his compound, watching workers install a helicopter landing pad that had been specifically designed to accommodate the presidential helicopter that would carry John Fitzgerald Kennedy to what was supposed to be a historic visit, cementing the alliance between the most powerful entertainer in America and the most powerful politician in the world. The construction had cost over $100,000, an investment that Sinatra considered trivial compared to the symbolic value of hosting a sitting president in a home that had been prepared to meet every security requirement the Secret Service had specified. The compound had been transformed over the preceding months into a facility capable of hosting the President of the United States, with the security and communications infrastructure that such a visit required. A separate building had been constructed to house Secret Service agents. Telephone lines had been installed that could connect directly to the White House switchboard, and every detail had been attended to with the perfectionism that characterized everything Frank Sinatra undertook when the stakes were sufficiently high. He had supported Kennedy's campaign in 1960 with an intensity that went far beyond the typical celebrity endorsement, organizing fundraisers that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars, recording a campaign song that became an anthem for the Kennedy movement, and leveraging his connections in ways that some historians would later suggest had been decisive in the razor-thin margin that delivered the White House to the young senator from Massachusetts. The relationship between Sinatra and the Kennedy family had seemed mutually beneficial during the campaign and the early months of the administration, a partnership between glamour and power that captured the imagination of an American public hungry for leaders who embodied the vitality and style that the new decade seemed to promise. Sinatra had been welcomed into the Kennedy inner circle, invited to the inauguration, and treated as an ally whose support was valued and whose continued involvement was desired. But something had changed in the weeks preceding the scheduled visit, a shift in the administration's attitude toward Sinatra that he had sensed but could not explain. Phone calls that had previously been returned within hours now went unanswered for days. Invitations that had previously been accepted with enthusiasm were now declined with vague excuses about scheduling conflicts. The warmth that had characterized his interactions with the Kennedy circle had been replaced by a coolness that seemed to grow more pronounced with each passing week. Peter Lawford had been Sinatra's primary connection to the Kennedy family, the brother-in-law whose marriage to Patricia Kennedy had made him part of the political dynasty that was reshaping American governance. Lawford had been a member of the Rat Pack, a fellow performer who had shared stages and screen time with Sinatra throughout the late 1950s, a friend whose loyalty Sinatra had never questioned, until the events that were about to unfold revealed the depth of his betrayal. The telephone call that ended everything came on a Thursday afternoon, 3 days before the president was scheduled to arrive. Lawford's voice carried an apologetic tone that immediately signaled bad news, the tone of someone who was about to deliver information that he knew would be devastating, but that he had no choice but to convey regardless of the consequences. He told Sinatra that the president would not be coming to Palm Springs, that the visit had been canceled due to security concerns that the Secret Service had identified, and that could not be adequately addressed regardless of the preparations that had been made. The explanation was delivered with a smoothness that suggested it had been rehearsed, a cover story designed to soften a blow that no amount of diplomatic language could actually cushion. Sinatra demanded to know what security concerns could possibly have arisen that had not been identified during the months of preparation. What had changed between the approval of every detail by Secret Service professionals and this sudden cancellation that made no sense to anyone who understood how thoroughly the compound had been secured. Lawford hesitated, and in that hesitation, Sinatra heard the truth that the words were designed to conceal, that the security explanation was a lie, that something else entirely was behind the cancellation, and that his supposed friend knew exactly what that something was, but was unwilling or unable to share it. The truth, which Sinatra would learn only later, was that Peter Lawford had systematically poisoned the president's perception of his former friend through a campaign of lies and insinuations that had been building for months. Lawford had told Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, whose war on organized crime had made Sinatra's connections to certain figures increasingly problematic, so that Sinatra could not be trusted with sensitive information about administration policies. He had suggested, without providing evidence, that Sinatra had shared details of private conversations with the Kennedy brothers with associates whose interests were not aligned with those of the administration. He had implied that continued association with Sinatra would create political liabilities that could damage the president's carefully cultivated image of ethical leadership. Most damagingly, Lawford had claimed that Sinatra had boasted publicly about his influence with the president, using the relationship to enhance his own status in ways that embarrassed the administration and created impressions of improper access that critics could exploit. These claims were false, but they were delivered by someone whose family connection gave him credibility that outsiders could not match. Robert Kennedy, already concerned about his brother's association with an entertainer whose friendships included figures his Justice Department was actively prosecuting, had seized upon Lawford's reports as justification for severing ties that he had always considered dangerous to the administration's long-term interests. He had advised the president that the Palm Springs visit should be cancelled and that future contact with Sinatra should be minimized. The president, torn between personal affection for Sinatra and political calculations that his brother presented with compelling logic, had ultimately accepted the recommendation that his brother and brother-in-law had jointly delivered. The security explanation had been devised as a face-saving measure that would allow the cancellation to occur without publicly humiliating an ally who had contributed significantly to the campaign that had put Kennedy in office. Before continuing with this investigation, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened between Frank Sinatra and the Kennedy administration in March 1962 involves one of the most consequential betrayals in entertainment history, a lie that severed an alliance between Hollywood and Washington, and a response from Sinatra that would reshape American politics in ways that historians are still debating today. By the end of this story, you will understand why Peter Lawford's deception cost him everything, and why Frank Sinatra's revenge extended far beyond personal satisfaction. Francis Albert Sinatra had survived decades in an industry that rewarded betrayal and punished loyalty, had watched friends become enemies and enemies become useful allies, had learned to navigate relationships with a cynicism that his public persona of warmth and generosity carefully concealed. But the betrayal by Peter Lawford struck at something deeper than professional calculation, something that touched the core of values that Sinatra considered sacred, regardless of how often they were violated by others. Loyalty was the principle that Sinatra elevated above all others, the quality he demanded from those he considered friends, and that he provided in return with a consistency that sometimes bordered on obsession. He had maintained friendships through scandals that drove others away, had supported artists whose careers had collapsed when support carried no benefit to the supporter, had demonstrated through decades of behavior that his word once given could be trusted absolutely. Lawford had violated that principle in the most damaging way possible, betraying not just a friendship, but the trust that Sinatra had extended by welcoming him into an inner circle that few were permitted to enter. The lies that Lawford had told were not merely inaccurate. They were calculated to destroy a relationship that Sinatra had valued precisely because it connected him to a world of political power that he had long admired from a distance. The rage that consumed Sinatra in the hours following Lawford's phone call was legendary among those who witnessed it, a fury that expressed itself in the destruction of the helicopter landing pad that had been built specifically for the presidential visit. He took a sledgehammer to the concrete himself, swinging with an intensity that worried his staff about his physical health, while they understood that no one could interfere with the expression of an anger that needed outlet. The destruction continued for hours, Sinatra attacking the symbols of a relationship that had been revealed as fraudulent, with a violence that left the compound's courtyard looking like a war zone. Workers who had spent weeks building structures to presidential specifications watched their labor demolished by a man whose grief and rage had merged into something that could only be satisfied by physical destruction. But the sledgehammer was merely the beginning of Sinatra's response to Lawford's betrayal. The destruction of concrete and steel was satisfying in the moment, but insufficient as revenge against someone who had caused damage that no amount of physical demolition could undo. Sinatra's true retaliation would unfold over years and would eventually reshape the political landscape of a nation whose leaders had underestimated what a determined enemy with unlimited resources could accomplish. The first step was severance, complete and permanent, from Peter Lawford and everyone associated with him. Sinatra's instructions to his staff were explicit. Lawford's name was never to be spoken in his presence. Lawford's calls were never to be connected. And Lawford's attendance at any event would automatically result in Sinatra's absence, regardless of the circumstances or the damage such absence might cause to other relationships. The entertainment industry quickly learned that association with Peter Lawford had become incompatible with association with Frank Sinatra, and that those who attempted to maintain relationships with both would find themselves forced to choose between an aging actor whose career was already in decline and the most powerful figure in American entertainment whose favor could make or break careers. The choice was obvious to most. Lawford found himself increasingly isolated from the circles he had once moved through, with the ease of someone whose family connections and personal charm had opened doors that talent alone could never have accessed. Directors stopped calling, producers developed scheduling conflicts, and the projects that had once competed for his participation dried up with a speed that made clear how much of his success had depended on Sinatra's implicit endorsement. But professional isolation was merely the appetizer before a main course of revenge that Sinatra had been planning from the moment he learned the truth about what Lawford had told the Kennedy brothers. The information had come from multiple sources within the administration, people whose loyalty to Sinatra exceeded their loyalty to employers who could be replaced, but whose friendship with the voice was irreplaceable. These sources revealed not just what Lawford had said, but why he had said it. Jealousy over Sinatra's access to the president that exceeded his own, despite his family connection. Resentment over Sinatra's dominance within the Rat Pack that left Lawford feeling like a subordinate rather than an equal. And calculation that eliminating Sinatra from the Kennedy circle would elevate his own position within a family that measured worth by usefulness. The motivations were petty, the execution was clumsy, and the consequences would be devastating for everyone involved, including the Kennedy administration that had accepted Lawford's lies without adequate investigation of their accuracy. Sinatra understood that revenge against Lawford personally was insufficient. The true target of his anger was a political machine that had used him when useful and discarded him when inconvenient. The political implications of Sinatra's break with the Kennedys became apparent during the 1962 midterm elections, when the fundraising apparatus that he had built for the 1960 campaign was conspicuously absent from Democratic efforts to maintain their congressional majorities. Donors who had contributed because Sinatra asked them to contribute now discovered that Sinatra was no longer asking, and their checkbooks remained closed to candidates who had expected support that never materialized. The entertainment industry's relationship with the Democratic Party had been largely mediated through Sinatra's influence, his ability to transform political events into glamorous occasions that attracted both money and media attention in ways that purely political gatherings could never achieve. Without his participation, Democratic fundraisers became noticeably less star-studded and significantly less lucrative. Sinatra did not actively campaign against Democratic candidates in 1962, understanding that such overt partisanship would damage his carefully cultivated image of patriotic independence that transcended party affiliation. But his absence from the campaign trail was noticed by political observers who understood how much his presence had contributed to Kennedy's victory 2 years earlier. The longer-term political consequences of the break began to manifest as Sinatra cultivated relationships with Republican figures who were happy to welcome an ally whose celebrity and fundraising abilities had previously been deployed exclusively for their opponents. His friendship with Ronald Reagan, then governor of California, deepened into a political alliance that would eventually contribute to transformations in American governance that Kennedy could never have anticipated. Sinatra's support for Republican candidates was not immediate or absolute. reflecting a gradual evolution in his political orientation that was driven as much by personal grievance as by ideological conviction. But the direction of his movement was clear to those who watched his behavior in the years following the Kennedy betrayal. The man who had been the most prominent entertainment supporter of Democratic causes was becoming increasingly comfortable in Republican company. The contrast between his treatment by the Kennedys and his reception by Republicans was stark and influential in shaping his political evolution. Where the Kennedys had ultimately rejected him, despite his contributions, Republican leaders welcomed his support with gratitude that bordered on deference, understanding that his endorsement carried weight that could influence millions of voters whose political engagement was shaped more by celebrity than by policy. Ronald Reagan's presidential campaigns in 1976 and 1980 benefited enormously from Sinatra's active support, including fundraising events that generated millions of dollars and personal appearances that attracted media attention to a candidacy that establishment Republicans initially viewed with skepticism. The man who had recorded high hopes for John Kennedy now lent his celebrity to a former actor whose political philosophy differed dramatically from the liberalism Sinatra had once championed. The transformation was not lost on political analysts who traced the entertainment industry's relationship with American politics through the arc of Sinatra's career. His movement from enthusiastic Kennedy supporter to Reagan intimate symbolized broader shifts in the cultural politics of celebrity that would continue to reshape American public life for decades to come. Peter Lawford watched these developments from an increasingly marginalized position, his career destroyed by Sinatra's blacklist and his family relationships strained by the fallout from a betrayal that had achieved none of the goals he had hoped to accomplish. His marriage to Patricia Kennedy ended in 1966, removing even the family connection that had been the foundation of whatever influence he had possessed. The irony was devastating. Lawford had betrayed Sinatra, hoping to elevate his own position within the Kennedy circle, but the betrayal had ultimately cost him everything while failing to provide the benefits he had anticipated. The Kennedys did not reward his disloyalty to Sinatra with increased trust or access. Instead, they seemed to view him with the suspicion that people who betray one friend might easily betray another. Robert Kennedy's assassination in 1968 ended whatever possibility remained of reconciliation between Sinatra and the Kennedy family, removing the Attorney General whose concerns about organized crime connections had provided the pretext for the break that Lawford had engineered. Ted Kennedy made occasional overtures to Sinatra in subsequent years, but the wounds were too deep and the betrayal too comprehensive for any genuine healing to occur. Sinatra's support for Republican candidates intensified following the Kennedy assassinations, as if the deaths had somehow validated his decision to sever ties with a family that had treated him as disposable despite his contributions to their political success. He performed at Republican events with an enthusiasm that exceeded anything he had ever displayed for Democratic causes. His commitment to his new political home deepened by the contrast with his previous treatment. The inauguration of Ronald Reagan in January 1981 represented the culmination of Sinatra's political journey from Kennedy ally to Republican icon, a transformation that had begun in a Palm Springs courtyard 19 years earlier, when a sledgehammer had demolished the helicopter pad built for a presidential visit that never occurred. Sinatra organized the inaugural entertainment with the same perfectionism he had once brought to preparations for hosting John Kennedy. The Reagan administration welcomed Sinatra into its inner circle with a warmth that the Kennedy administration had ultimately denied him, treating his celebrity and his fundraising abilities as valuable assets rather than potential liabilities. Nancy Reagan, in particular, developed a friendship with Sinatra that provided the social access he had once hoped to enjoy with the Kennedys. The state dinners and White House events that Sinatra attended during the Reagan years represented vindication of a sort, proof that his value as a political ally had always been genuine, even if one administration had failed to recognize it. He brought the same glamour to Republican Washington that he had once brought to Democratic campaigns, his presence transforming political occasions into entertainment events, that attracted attention far beyond what policy discussions alone could generate. His influence on Republican politics extended beyond mere celebrity endorsement, encompassing fundraising networks that had been redirected from Democratic to Republican causes, and personal relationships with donors whose support for Republican candidates was encouraged by Sinatra's example. The transformation of Hollywood from a Democratic stronghold to a more politically diverse community owed something to the example he set in breaking with a party that had broken with him. Peter Lawford died on December 24, 1984. His final years marked by addiction, poverty and isolation from virtually everyone who had once considered him a friend. His body was cremated and his ashes were eventually scattered at sea, a fitting end for a man who had drifted through life without the anchor of principles that might have prevented the betrayal that had destroyed everything he valued. Sinatra refused to acknowledge Lawford's death publicly, maintaining the silence that had characterized his treatment of his former friend since the revelation of his betrayal 22 years earlier. The grudge had outlasted Lawford's career, his marriage, his relationships, and finally his life. A testament to the permanence of Sinatra's rage when he felt that loyalty had been violated. The historical significance of the Sinatra-Kennedy break has been debated by scholars who disagree about how much influence entertainment figures actually wield in American politics and whether Sinatra's shift from Democratic to Republican support made any measurable difference in electoral outcomes. Some argue that his impact has been overstated by biographers seeking to enhance their subject's importance. Others contend that his influence on the cultural politics of celebrity has been more significant than voting patterns alone can measure. What cannot be disputed is that Sinatra's response to Lawford's betrayal transformed his own political trajectory and contributed to broader transformations in the entertainment industry's relationship with American political parties. The man who had been the most prominent celebrity Democrat of his generation became an equally prominent Republican, a journey that began with a lie told by a jealous friend and ended with inaugurations and state dinners that would have been unimaginable in the world that lie had destroyed. The Kennedy administration's decision to accept Lawford's characterization of Sinatra without adequate investigation reflected a broader pattern of dismissing entertainment industry figures as useful but ultimately expendable allies whose concerns about fair treatment could be ignored without consequence. This attitude would be challenged repeatedly in subsequent decades as celebrities discovered their own political power and learned to exercise it independently. Sinatra's example demonstrated that celebrities possessed resources and influence that could be deployed against political figures who treated them as disposable, that the relationship between entertainment and politics was not as asymmetrical as politicians sometimes assumed. The lesson was absorbed by subsequent generations of entertainment figures who learned to negotiate their political relationships with a sophistication that Sinatra had been forced to develop through painful experience. The lies that Peter Lawford told Robert Kennedy in 1962 were never definitively proven false during Sinatra's lifetime, allowing some historians to suggest that perhaps Lawford's concerns had been legitimate, even if his methods were questionable. But documents released after Sinatra's death revealed that Lawford had fabricated specific claims about conversations that never occurred and had attributed statements to Sinatra that he had never made. The evidence of deliberate deception, rather than honest misunderstanding, vindicated Sinatra's rage and justified the comprehensive revenge he had pursued against someone who had not merely erred, but had calculated a betrayal designed to serve personal interests at the expense of a supposed friend. The lies were not mistakes. They were weapons deployed with the intention of causing damage that could not be undone. Patricia Kennedy Lawford, who had been caught between her husband's ambitions and her family's interests, never publicly discussed what she knew about the betrayal that had destroyed Sinatra's relationship with her brothers. Her silence suggested either loyalty to a husband she had divorced or uncertainty about facts that she could not independently verify, despite her proximity to all the principles involved. The Rat Pack, which had defined a particular moment in American entertainment history, never recovered from the fracture that Lawford's betrayal had created. Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and Joey Bishop maintained their relationships with Sinatra, while accepting that Lawford had been permanently expelled from a circle whose membership had once seemed unassailable. The group's cultural moment passed, replaced by musical and comedic styles that left the tuxedoed sophistication of the Rat Pack seeming like a relic of an earlier era. Sinatra's later years included occasional reflections on the Kennedy period that revealed an ambivalence more complex than simple rage. He had genuinely admired John Kennedy, had believed in the vision of American renewal that Kennedy had articulated, and had invested emotionally as well as financially in a political movement that had seemed to promise transformation that never fully materialized. The betrayal had been painful precisely because the relationship had been genuine. The helicopter pad that Sinatra destroyed in March 1962 was never rebuilt, its absence a permanent reminder of a visit that never occurred and a friendship that was destroyed by lies told for reasons that seemed adequate at the time, but that appeared increasingly petty as years passed and consequences accumulated. The concrete fragments were eventually cleared away, but the empty space remained. Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998, having outlived most of the principles in the drama that had reshaped his political identity and contributed to transformations in American governance that continued long after the personal grievances that had sparked them had faded into historical footnote. His influence on the relationship between entertainment and politics remained debated but undeniable. The Kennedy Presidential Library contains documents related to the break with Sinatra that scholars continue to analyze for insights into how personal relationships shape political decisions at the highest levels of American government. The lesson that emerges from these documents is that presidents are human beings, whose judgments can be swayed by advisors, whose motives may not align with the interests they claim to serve. Peter Lawford's lie changed American politics by transforming an ally into an enemy whose capabilities for revenge exceeded anything a minor actor could have anticipated when he decided that destroying Sinatra's relationship with the Kennedys would serve his own interests. The consequences extended far beyond the personal satisfaction of anyone involved, reshaping political alignments that would persist for generations. The entertainment industry's relationship with American political parties has never returned to the simplicity that characterized the era when Sinatra's support for Democrats seemed as natural and permanent as his voice. His example demonstrated that celebrity loyalty could be forfeited through mistreatment, and that the consequences of such forfeiture could be politically significant. The campaign of 1960 had represented the high point of Sinatra's relationship with the Democratic Party, a moment when his talents and his connections had been deployed with maximum effect on behalf of a candidate he genuinely believed would transform American society. He had organized fundraising events that broke records for political entertainment, had persuaded fellow celebrities to lend their names and their presence to a campaign that needed the glamour that only Hollywood could provide. The famous rally at the Los Angeles Memorial Sports Arena had been Sinatra's production, a spectacular event that drew tens of thousands of supporters and generated media coverage that money could not have purchased. He had performed personally, had introduced the candidate with words that captured the enthusiasm of a generation, that saw in Kennedy the embodiment of everything they hoped America could become. The victory in November had felt personal to Sinatra, a vindication of his belief that entertainment and politics could be partners in shaping a better future. He had attended the inauguration as an honored guest, had organized entertainment for the celebration that followed, and had basked in the reflected glory of an administration that seemed to welcome his continued involvement. The months that followed had reinforced his sense of belonging to the Kennedy inner circle. Invitations to dinners and events where policy was discussed in his presence, as if his opinion on matters of governance carried weight equal to his expertise in matters of entertainment. He had been treated as an ally whose counsel was valued, whose support was appreciated, whose future involvement was anticipated with pleasure rather than reluctance. The preparations for the presidential visit to Palm Springs had begun in late 1961, when Sinatra learned that Kennedy was planning a trip to California that would include time for relaxation away from the pressures of Washington. The invitation had been extended and apparently accepted, setting in motion the elaborate preparations that would ultimately be rendered meaningless by Lawford's intervention. The Secret Service requirements had been extensive and expensive, requiring modifications to the compound that went far beyond normal hospitality preparations. Communications equipment capable of connecting the president to the White House had been installed, security perimeters had been established, and every detail had been coordinated with federal agencies whose approval was necessary for any presidential visit. Sinatra had personally supervised every aspect of the preparations, his perfectionism extending to details that others might have delegated to staff. The rooms that would accommodate the president and his entourage had been decorated to standards that exceeded anything the compound had previously offered. The menus had been planned with attention to Kennedy's known preferences, and the entertainment options had been curated to ensure that the presidential visit would be memorable for all the right reasons. The helicopter pad that became the focus of Sinatra's rage had been the most visible symbol of his commitment to hosting the president properly, a concrete manifestation of his willingness to transform his private residence into a facility capable of accommodating the requirements of presidential security. Its construction had required permits, engineering assessments, and coordination with aviation authorities, whose approval was necessary for any landing zone that would receive presidential aircraft. The workers who built the pad had understood that they were creating something significant, that their labor was contributing to an event that would be remembered in the history of the compound and perhaps in the broader history of the relationship between entertainment and politics. They had taken pride in their work, ensuring that every detail met specifications that had been provided by authorities, whose standards reflected the importance of the visitor who would use their creation. The cancellation of the visit had rendered all of this preparation meaningless, transforming months of work and hundreds of thousands of dollars of investment into monuments to a relationship that had been destroyed by lies that Sinatra had not yet learned about when Lawford delivered the news that the president would not be coming. The security explanation had seemed implausible even before Sinatra discovered the truth, raising questions that Lawford's evasive answers only intensified. The alternative location that the president chose for his California relaxation was the home of Bing Crosby, a Republican whose political affiliations were precisely opposite to those Sinatra had championed throughout the 1960 campaign. The symbolism of this choice was not lost on anyone who understood the dynamics of Hollywood politics, a deliberate insult that communicated the administration's disdain for an ally whose support had been enthusiastically accepted when useful and cavalierly discarded when inconvenient. Crosby had not been a Kennedy supporter, had not organized fundraisers or recorded campaign songs, or leveraged his connections on behalf of the young senator from Massachusetts. His selection as the president's host communicated a message that transcended mere logistics, that Sinatra's political contributions had been rendered worthless by whatever concerns had motivated the administration to sever ties that had once seemed so strong. The humiliation was compounded by the public nature of the president's California visit, media coverage that documented Kennedy's relaxation at a location that was not the compound Sinatra had prepared, and that belonged to someone whose political loyalty had never been offered to the administration that now enjoyed his hospitality. Every photograph of Kennedy at Crosby's home was a reminder of the relationship that Lawford's lies had destroyed. Sinatra's investigation into what had actually happened began immediately after the cancellation, his resources and connections deployed to uncover the truth that Lawford's evasions had concealed. The entertainment industry was small enough that information traveled quickly, and Sinatra had cultivated sources throughout Washington and Hollywood whose loyalty to him exceeded their discretion about conversations they had witnessed or overheard. The picture that emerged from these investigations was devastating. A systematic campaign by Lawford to poison the administration's perception of Sinatra through fabrications that exploited legitimate concerns about organized crime connections while adding false details that transformed reasonable caution into complete rejection. The lies had been specific enough to be credible and damaging enough to be fatal to the relationship. Lawford had claimed that Sinatra had discussed details of private conversations with Kennedy with Sam Giancana, the Chicago crime boss, whose relationship with both Sinatra and the Kennedy campaign had been a source of ongoing concern for Robert Kennedy's Justice Department. The claim was false, but it exploited real connections that made verification seem unnecessary to officials who were already predisposed to distance themselves from an ally whose associations had become problematic. The Attorney General had been particularly receptive to Lawford's reports, his crusade against organized crime, creating a framework within which any association with figures like Giancana was automatically suspicious. Robert Kennedy had never been comfortable with his brother's friendship with Sinatra, viewing it as a political liability that could be exploited by opponents who were already suggesting that the Kennedy administration was insufficiently committed to law enforcement. Lawford had understood these dynamics and had crafted his lies to exploit them with maximum effectiveness, providing Robert Kennedy with ammunition that aligned perfectly with concerns the Attorney General had already expressed. The fabrications seemed to confirm suspicions that had existed before Lawford began his campaign of deception, lending them a credibility that their author had deliberately designed. The motivations behind Lawford's betrayal were multiple and interrelated, combining personal jealousy with professional resentment and social insecurity that his family connection to the Kennedys could not fully assuage. He had always been the least successful member of the Rat Pack, dependent on Sinatra's goodwill for professional opportunities that his own talent could not have secured. His marriage to Patricia Kennedy had provided social status that his career could never have delivered, access to a world of wealth and power that exceeded anything available through Hollywood achievement alone. But the marriage had also created expectations that he struggled to meet, pressure to demonstrate worth that his professional accomplishments could not adequately establish. Sinatra's easy access to the president had highlighted Lawford's relative marginality within the Kennedy circle, his family connection insufficient to compete with the genuine friendship that existed between his brother-in-law and the entertainer, whose celebrity exceeded anything Lawford could ever hope to achieve. The jealousy this disparity created had festered until it found expression in the betrayal that would ultimately cost Lawford everything. The destruction that Sinatra wrought upon his compound in the hours following the cancellation was witnessed by staff members whose accounts of that afternoon varied in detail, but agreed on the essential character of what they had seen. A man possessed by rage that exceeded anything they had previously witnessed, demolishing symbols of a relationship that had been revealed as fraudulent with an energy that seemed inexhaustible despite its obvious physical cost. The sledgehammer had been retrieved from a storage area where tools were kept for compound maintenance, an instrument designed for construction, now deployed for destruction by hands that had more typically held microphones and martini glasses. Sinatra had swung the heavy tool for hours, his elegant clothing soaked with sweat and covered with concrete dust, his face contorted with an expression that combined grief and fury in equal measure. The helicopter pad was not the only target of his rage, though it was the most symbolic. He had also attacked a plaque that had been prepared to commemorate the presidential visit, a sign that had been designed to mark the guest cottage where Kennedy would have stayed, and various other elements of the preparations that had been made with such care and were now revealed as monuments to naivety. The physical destruction was cathartic but insufficient, a momentary release of emotions that would require years of sustained action to fully express. Sinatra understood that the revenge he sought could not be accomplished through violence against inanimate objects, that the true targets of his anger were people and relationships and political structures that could only be damaged through patient, systematic effort. The blacklisting of Peter Lawford began immediately, instructions communicated through Sinatra's extensive network of professional contacts that anyone who wished to maintain a relationship with The Voice would need to sever ties with the man who had betrayed him. The entertainment industry's power structure quickly calculated the relative value of these relationships and reached conclusions that were devastating for Lawford. Directors who had been considering Lawford for projects suddenly discovered that those projects were no longer interested in his participation. Producers who had maintained professional relationships with both men found themselves forced to choose between an actor, whose career was already declining, and an entertainment titan, whose favor could determine the success or failure of any production. The mathematics of Hollywood self-interest produced predictable results. Lawford's final significant film role came in 1963. His career effectively ended by a blacklist that was never formally announced, but that operated with an efficiency that left no doubt about its existence or its author. He continued to accept minor television appearances and small roles in forgettable productions, but the trajectory of his career made clear that the heights he had once achieved were no longer accessible to someone whose principal patron had become his implacable enemy. The Rat Pack's other members navigated the split with varying degrees of difficulty, their relationships with both Sinatra and Lawford requiring careful management that ultimately resolved in favor of the man whose power and generosity they depended upon. Dean Martin, whose friendship with Sinatra was the deepest and most durable, simply accepted that Lawford was no longer part of their world and adjusted accordingly. Sammy Davis Jr. faced a more complicated situation, his own vulnerabilities creating sympathy for someone who had been expelled from paradise, while simultaneously requiring him to maintain Sinatra's favor as protection against an industry that had never fully accepted him despite his extraordinary talents. He chose loyalty to Sinatra while privately grieving a rupture that had destroyed something precious. Joey Bishop, whose position in the Rat Pack had always been the most tenuous, aligned himself unambiguously with Sinatra and distanced himself from Lawford with a completeness that erased any ambiguity about where his loyalties lay. The calculation was professional as well as personal, a recognition that his continued success depended on remaining in Sinatra's good graces, regardless of whatever sympathy he might have felt for the man who had been expelled. The political dimensions of Sinatra's revenge unfolded more gradually than the professional destruction of Lawford's career, requiring time and opportunity that could not be manufactured regardless of how much money or influence was available. The Kennedy administration remained in power until November 1963, limiting Sinatra's ability to effect political consequences for their treatment of him during the president's lifetime. The assassination of John Kennedy on November 22, 1963, transformed the political landscape in ways that complicated Sinatra's planned revenge, while also eliminating the possibility of reconciliation that some had hoped might eventually occur. The president, whose friendship Sinatra had valued and whose rejection had wounded him so deeply, was gone, replaced by Lyndon Johnson, whose relationship with the entertainment industry followed different patterns. Robert Kennedy's assassination in June 1968 further altered the dynamics, removing the Attorney General whose hostility to Sinatra had been instrumental in the original break and whose continued presence in American politics might have provided opportunities for confrontation that his death now foreclosed. The Kennedy family's political dominance was fading, their grip on power weakening with each tragedy that struck their dynastic ambitions. Sinatra's transition toward Republican politics accelerated during the Nixon years, his disenchantment with Democrats extending beyond the specific grievances of the Kennedy break to encompass broader disagreements about the direction of American society. The counterculture that dominated Democratic politics during the late 1960s and early 1970s represented everything that Sinatra found distasteful about the changes transforming his country. His friendship with Spiro Agnew, Nixon's vice president, raised eyebrows among those who remembered his passionate advocacy for Kennedy, but made sense to those who understood how completely the betrayal had transformed his political orientation. Agnew's combative relationship with media and cultural elites resonated with Sinatra's own resentments toward institutions that he felt had mistreated him despite his contributions. The Watergate scandal that destroyed the Nixon administration briefly threatened to complicate Sinatra's evolving Republican identification, but he navigated the crisis by focusing his support on figures untainted by the scandal's corruption. His friendship with Ronald Reagan, which had begun during Reagan's gubernatorial years, intensified as the former actor emerged as the standard-bearer of a conservatism that Sinatra found increasingly congenial. Reagan's failed presidential campaign in 1976 received Sinatra's enthusiastic support, fundraising and appearances that demonstrated his commitment to a candidate whose political philosophy differed dramatically from the liberalism he had once championed. The loss to Gerald Ford in the Republican primary did not diminish Sinatra's enthusiasm for a candidate he believed would eventually succeed in capturing the presidency. The 1980 campaign fulfilled that prediction. Reagan's victory over Jimmy Carter, delivering the White House to a Republican, whose friendship with Sinatra would be rewarded with the access and influence that the Kennedy administration had ultimately denied. The inauguration festivities that Sinatra organized represented the culmination of a political journey that had begun in rage and ended in triumph. The Reagan administration's embrace of Sinatra was comprehensive and genuine, reflecting appreciation for his support that contrasted sharply with the Kennedy administration's ultimate rejection. He performed at state dinners, attended White House events as an honored guest, and enjoyed the kind of access to presidential power that he had once believed his support for Kennedy had earned. Nancy Reagan's friendship with Sinatra was particularly significant, providing social connections that reinforced his political involvement and demonstrated the administration's appreciation for his support. The First Lady's influence on her husband's social calendar ensured that Sinatra remained a welcome presence at events where political and entertainment worlds intersected. The contrast between his treatment by Democratic and Republican administrations reinforced Sinatra's conviction that his political evolution had been justified by results as well as by the grievances that had initiated his transformation. The party that had used him and discarded him had been replaced by a party that valued his contributions and rewarded his loyalty with the respect he had always deserved. Peter Lawford's final years provided grim evidence of the consequences that betrayal could bring when the person betrayed possessed the resources and the determination to exact revenge across decades. His addiction to alcohol and drugs intensified as his career collapsed and his social position evaporated, creating a downward spiral from which he never recovered. His divorce from Patricia Kennedy in 1966 removed the family connection that had been the foundation of whatever influence he had once possessed, leaving him without the resources or the relationships that might have enabled recovery from the professional destruction that Sinatra's blacklist had caused. He married 3 more times, each union shorter and more troubled than the last. The poverty that marked his final years was particularly cruel for someone who had once moved through the highest circles of American entertainment and politics, dining with presidents and performing alongside the greatest stars of his generation. He died owing substantial debts, his estate insufficient to cover the costs of his final illness and the legal complications that followed his death. The cremation of his body and the scattering of his ashes at sea erased the physical evidence of his existence, leaving no grave where those who had once considered him a friend might visit to pay respects. The absence of a permanent memorial seemed appropriate for a man whose legacy was defined by absence. Absence of loyalty, absence of integrity, absence of the qualities that might have enabled him to maintain the relationships he had betrayed. Sinatra never publicly commented on Lawford's death, maintaining the silence that had characterized his treatment of his former friend since the revelation of his betrayal more than 2 decades earlier. The grudge had outlasted Lawford's career, his marriages, his health, and finally, his life, a testament to the permanence of Sinatra's anger when principles he considered sacred were violated. The entertainment industry absorbed the lesson that Sinatra's treatment of Lawford had taught, understanding that betrayal of the voice carried consequences that could extend for lifetimes, and that no amount of subsequent success could undo damage caused by disloyalty. The example was cited in discussions of Hollywood politics for decades, a cautionary tale whose implications extended far beyond the specific individuals involved. The political lessons were equally significant, demonstrating that celebrities possessed independent agency that politicians ignored at their peril. The Kennedy administration's assumption that Sinatra could be discarded without consequence had proven catastrophically wrong. His transformation from Democratic ally to Republican icon, contributing to political transformations that outlasted everyone who had participated in the original drama. Rest in peace, Francis Albert Sinatra. The voice that defined an era also spoke through political choices that reshaped the relationship between entertainment and governance in ways that continue to influence American public life. The lies that drove you from one party to another were never your fault, and the revenge you extracted was proportional to the betrayal you suffered. And as for Peter Lawford, history has rendered its judgment on a man whose jealousy cost him everything while gaining him nothing, whose lies destroyed a friendship that had been genuine, and whose legacy is a cautionary tale about the consequences of betraying someone whose capacity for revenge exceeded anything his limited imagination could conceive.